Hello everyone, my name is Marian Guevara. A huge hello and a huge thank you to anyone who has just clicked on this video or checking out the channel. Whether you are a new subscriber or an old subscriber, or if you're just a visitor, thank you very much. Your viewership is always greatly appreciated. And if you are visiting here on this channel, we talk about books, movies, and more. And today, in this specific video, I'll be going over four books in particular, that I attempted to read in the past, and for whatever reason I just didn't finish it. I DNF'd it, but then later on I went back to them. I attempted to read them again, and I ended up either gaining a better appreciation for the story or just outright adoring and loving it. I do believe that there are cases where you have a book in your hands and you have this very strong feeling that you know you're going to connect with this story. However, due to various factors, you're not able to form that connection. And sometimes all it takes is setting down the book and then acknowledging the fact that, hey, maybe not right now. Maybe later, later down the line. Yes, there are instances where a book just isn't for you. However, there are cases where maybe second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth times the charm. So yeah, without further ado, let me show you these books. So for this first one, I actually don't own a physical copy of it, but I will put a picture here. And it is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Now, I attempted to read this book back in middle school. Pretty sure it was middle school, so around the ages of 11 to 13. In fact, out of the four books here, Wuthering Heights is the only one that I finished on my first attempt. And I think it's quite clear to me that I was just too young at the time for Wuthering Heights. I was too young to properly appreciate it. And yeah, I remember finishing this book and not liking it, and a large part of that had to do with the characters of Heathcliff and Catherine. They annoyed me. They annoyed me very much. I think it's very interesting how people will be like, oh, I hate The Great Gatsby, I can't stand it because all the characters are unlikable. I would sit down to tea with any character from The Great Gatsby, then share a room, like stand in the same room with Heathcliff or Catherine for like 5 minutes. And then another reason why I didn't really care for Wuthering Heights is because of the, format. So we are following, when the book opens, we are following a stranger who ends up staying in Wuthering Heights. And he finds out the story of Heathcliff and Catherine, not from either Heathcliff or Catherine, but from another person. So another person is telling the stranger the tale of Heathcliff and Catherine. So I just felt that we were twice removed from the narrative that really interested me. So I felt detached. I read Wuthering Heights again. I don't remember exactly when. If it was in my second or third year of college, I don't exactly remember. But I did reread it. And while it's still not my favorite out of the Brontes that I've read, I definitely like it better than I initially did back when I was in middle school. On the second attempt, I was still peeved off with Heathcliff and Catherine. However, I do feel I had a stronger understanding, a grip on these characters. The way that Emily portrayed them, seeing their pasts, their personalities, their temperaments, and how all those things influence their actions. Still annoyed me, but I had a better understanding or appreciation for it and what Emily was doing with these characters. I still wasn't a fan of the way we were doubly detached from the whole Heathcliff-Catherine relationship. Although, looking back on it, maybe the idea is that, because Heathcliff and Catherine have such this strong bond, this almost unearthly bond to one another, maybe as outsiders we're not meant to be privy to this relationship. It's always something that is kind of shrouded in mystery, and it's only for those two to properly understand and to know. So yeah, maybe that's the reason. I don't know, but that's kind of how I look at it and justify why the narrative is structured this way. I also came away from that second attempt with a better appreciation for Emily Bronte's writing. Some great prose in Wuthering Heights, and who knows, maybe later down the line when I do reread Wuthering Heights, I might like it even more than the second attempt that I made. Maybe when I read it or reread it a third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, I'll end up loving the book. Who knows? Now, moving on to the second book, we have Tender is the Night by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I attempted to read this back in college, and I'm fairly certain the reason why I ended up DNFing it on my first attempt is because I was just so busy at the time with all my classes. And admittedly, the beginning is a bit slow. There's a lot of build-up in the beginning, and there's a certain point where some intrigue kind of kicks in. But years later, I sat down, buckled down to reread it. And yeah, this is tied now with The Great Gatsby as my favorite Fitzgerald. I go between the two. Which one is my favorite of his works? This is basically a book that is about disillusionment. And I described it in my one wrap-up video where you're following this man slowly falling into oblivion. It came out in 1934 and it was not received well. Even, I think, Hemingway, his friend, kind of had harsh words for him. But years later, Hemingway kind of looked back on it and had some things to say about Tender is the Night, stating that he proposed, actually, that critics were more focused on picking apart the flaws of the book rather than acknowledging the merits, and that the backlash against Tender is the Night by some critics was a backlash. It was sort of a Depression-era backlash against Fitzgerald and his status as a Jazz Age symbol. This Jazz Age label that stuck around with Fitzgerald, it hindered him at times, and he acknowledged this. There were times where he would be submitting short stories to publishers, and they'd be like, well, I don't know about this. This doesn't seem you. Because people associated Fitzgerald with stories about bright young things, falling in love. But even he understood, he couldn't do that again. He was an older man. He was a different person. That well dried up. And if he tried to retread that same ground, he acknowledged that he'd be a hack. There is a pervading sense of weariness when it comes to Fitzgerald's later works. You see it in short stories like Babylon Revisited. You see it here in Tender is the Night. Here you have a character that is initially presented to us as full of vitality and strength and a bit of mystique. However, as the narrative continues, you slowly see it draining from him, or rather he starts relinquishing it. He starts to lose his grip on himself, haunted by the doubts, the fears, the choices he's made in the past, and his situation in the present. You see how it all affects him, and he slowly starts to crack, to break. And yeah, by the end, it's quite sad. And of course, it's accompanied by Fitzgerald's beautiful prose. Of course, I've tabbed this book many times. So yeah, I do think that this is an overlooked Fitzgerald. We often talk about his early short stories or The Great Gatsby, but if you haven't tried Tender is the Night, maybe you'll love it. Or maybe if you don't love it the first time, maybe you'll be like me and enjoy it the second time. Next we have Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. This is a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. I don't remember exactly the year I read this initially, but I read it a few years back, and I remember I was going through a very stressful time, and I just wasn't in the right headspace to properly enjoy this book. So I did end up DNFing it. And then I revisited it like maybe a year or two later. And yeah, I ended up really loving it. And it was one of my favorite books of the year that I read. Till We Have Faces is very interesting in the sense that we are not following the perspectives of either Cupid or Psyche, but rather the perspective of one of Psyche's sisters. So in the original myth, Psyche has two sisters that are very envious and spiteful towards her. However, in this retelling, one of the sisters, instead of hating Psyche, loves her to a fault, and she's heartbroken when Psyche has to be taken away to be sacrificed to this god. And this is a story about a character who was never properly loved, and so does not know how to properly love in return. It's about the selfishness of possession, the selflessness of love, and how possession can be mistaken for love. While this is a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche, I found this to be a very moving and insightful character study. Following this person who has lived a long life, and they're looking back on their past with bitterness and hatred and so much regret, but then also coming face to face with their own flaws, their own faults, their own wrongdoings. So I know that myth retellings have been done to death. However, if you're in the mood for one, you can't go wrong with Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. I definitely need to read more from him. Lastly, we move on to the book that inspired this entire video. It's my most recent read, and that is The Buried Giant by Kazuo Ishiguro. Now, I do know when I actually attempted this book for the first time, that was back in 2017, so nearly 8 years ago. So 8 or nearly 8 years ago when I tried to read this book. I actually made it halfway through and I ended up DNFing it. At the time, I just felt it was too slow. It was meandering. However, 8 years pass and I see this book while I'm on my trip in Stockholm, and I just have this feeling. I have this gut feeling like I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to pick it up, I'm going to read it again, and I'm actually going to enjoy it this time around. And I was right. So this takes place in a post-Roman, post-Arthurian time. So yes, there are fantasy elements in it. We're in a misty land that is sort of shrouded in forgetfulness. People are constantly forgetting things. And we're following an elderly Briton couple who remembered that they have a son that they haven't seen in years. And here you're following this elderly couple who are kind of low in the pecking order of their village. They're kind of teased and made fun of. They're made fun of because of their age. And they're going on this admittedly treacherous journey that is spurred on by love. A love for their son, a wish to see him, but also the devotion that is between the two of them. And I think that's also what really endeared me to this premise. One of the complaints that I have heard people address with regards to The Buried Giant is the fact that they couldn't really connect with Axel and Beatrice. And yeah, admittedly, these are not dynamic characters, okay? We are not dealing with Joe Abercrombie levels of characterization going on here. I mean, they're quite simple. But honestly, I feel that makes them more relatable and even realistic. The Buried Giant is all about memory, about the long dark shadow that memory casts upon our own individual lives, but then the grander scheme of things as well. It begs the question about whether or not it's worth to hold on to painful memories. Are they truly beneficial? Are you better off, forgetting them? Or without them, are the way we perceive ourselves ultimately incomplete? Are our relationships ultimately incomplete? And all of this is explored in a land that felt familiar, but then also felt shrouded in mystery. As I mentioned, this is a post-Arthurian setting, so there are fantastical elements like dragons and strange beasts. But the way Ishiguro depicts all of these creatures, all these elements, it's like it's behind this hazy veil, and it retains a bit of mystery and mystique. Despite the fact that this is fantasy, don't expect there to be like high octane action scenes or anything like that. It's not the type of like fantasy you would expect with more modern fantasies. This is very much a contemplative read, and the heart of this book is this relationship between Axel and Beatrice, the devotion they have for one another, even if they can't remember, if they don't have all of their memories. A lot of times when I read Ishiguro, I felt the same way when I read Never Let Me Go. When I read that book, there weren't really any scenes that kind of just like, struck me in the heart and like made me want to cry. It was only after I got to the end, I closed the book, that the impact just fell. Like I got the gut punch at the end. It's a slow, quiet, but still poignant type of, heart-wrenching end. And yeah, I was kind of fighting back tears after I had finished this book. I do feel that it helped being a more seasoned reader, coming back to this book. I feel that I've gotten more patient over the years. I've come to appreciate perhaps slower narratives. And yeah, The Buried Giant definitely worked for me this second go around. And yeah, it will be joining my favorite books of 2025. I can definitely see it. So yeah, those were the books that I had to show to you today. Thank you much for watching. I hope you really enjoyed. Please let me know down in the comments, is there a book that you initially DNF'd, that you initially thought, this isn't for me, but then perhaps you reread it, you went back to it, and it turns out, no, actually, I do really enjoy this. And maybe there was just something in the past, some factor that was kind of getting in my way of appreciating this story. So yeah, let me know down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. and I will see you in the next video. Bye!